Right, so we have gone over the EEG system that's most commonly used in the clinic, this 1020 system. We know that it picks up synchronous discharges of large populations of neurons, that each electrode position has an ID, which has a letter which tells you what lobe it is, and a number which tells you both which hemisphere the electrode is in and also its position relative to the midline. So here we see a focal seizure. Now, how do we know it's focal? Because we have this large scale synchronous activity on these three channels, F3 minus C3, C3 minus P3, and P3 minus O1, right? So these are all odd numbers, so they're all in the left hemisphere. So what we'd want to do is go and check the corresponding ones in the other hemisphere. So here's F4 minus C4, and we see maybe a little ripple of something going on, but it certainly is not this synchronous activity that is mirrored across this whole frontocentral, even all the way to the occipital lobe signal. There again, if we look, there seems to be something unusual happening here, but again, these are odd numbers. These are all in the left hemisphere. Okay, so this is a focal seizure. On the other hand, this is a generalized seizure. This is actually one that's been induced via photostimulation. So, depending on whether the subject can only have a seizure induced by um, abnormal photostimulation, decides whether this person has epilepsy or not. If this person can walk around all day long for years at a time and not have a seizure, and only have a seizure when they're exposed to these flashing lights, then this person does not have epilepsy. So what we see is high amplitude synchronous activities on leads that both have odd and even numbers. This is a generalized seizure. So that's a pretty clear cut definition. Okay, uh, a slightly more difficult definition, slightly less cut and dry definition, is the idea that a seizure may be simple or complex. So a simple seizure does not involve the loss of consciousness, while a complex seizure involves a complete or partial loss of consciousness. That's where things get a bit tricky. Now, these terms are a bit opaque, right? If you were to tell somebody, did you know there are two types of seizures, simple or complex? What do you think that means? They would never guess in a million years that that meant, uh, you know, not losing consciousness and losing consciousness. So they are being replaced by aware and impaired awareness seizures. But those terms are still being encouraged, and they're not that common. So generalized seizures are always complex, right? There is no such thing as a simple generalized seizure. This is in part, well, this is assumed to be the case and is probably true. It probably truly is the case because the whole brain is essentially being entrained to this abnormal activity. And so there is no physical mechanism for the establishment of consciousness because the brain is essentially gone into this abnormal mode. And so you lose consciousness. However, in a partial seizure, it may only be a small portion of the brain that has gone into this abnormal mode, and so consciousness can be um, maintained. So, as it says there, we have simple partial seizures, complex partial seizures, and generalized seizures because generalized seizures are always complex. Now, this is where things start to get even more difficult, and it's even more tempting to say that some of these definitions, these categorizations, may not be useful. But you will still see these discussed in the literature a lot. So the question is, in a generalized seizure, what kind of motor output do you see? And you can get motor output in partial seizures as well. So a myoclonic seizure is one that involves brief muscular jerks. A clonic seizure involves pulses of muscular contraction. That's possibly what a lot of people think of when they think of a seizure. A tonic seizure involves muscle rigidity, so all the muscles are active at once, and a tonic-clonic seizure involves the initial rigidity of the tonic seizure, then moving into those pulses of muscular contraction. Finally, you have well, not finally in this list, but of these sort of motor definitions, you have atonic seizure, which is the complete loss of muscle tone, so that can involve falling, though some people will consider, so long as posture is maintained but all other muscles are relaxed, that still counts as an atonic seizure. And then finally, and I will argue that this is a completely separate category of seizure, is the absence seizure. So this is a generalized seizure. It involves the brief loss of consciousness, but there is no loss of postural control. Now, in some cases, we truly know the cause of epilepsy, and in these cases, these have names, right? So, for instance, there's the benign familial neonatal seizures. These are um, a, a very distressing disease that involves babies developing tonic-clonic seizures at a week old. Now, thankfully, these seizures nearly always cease by the time the child is 6 months old, and this is caused by a mutation in one of the voltage-gated potassium channels. It causes a reduced current or slowed activation. There are a collection of slightly different mutations that all have the same phenotype. I mean, calling them benign is a bit of a stretch, I can tell you. If you're not a parent, if your week-old baby started having seizures, you would think it was anything but benign, but still, that's what they're called. On the other hand, there is Dravet syndrome. So this is associated with mutation in the primary voltage-gated sodium channel, and their seizures develop at about a year old, and they're associated with severe developmental delays and a massive increase in sudden death. In fact, sudden death is something that you see in all poorly controlled epilepsy, that people will go to sleep and they will not wake up. And we still don't really know what is causing them, but it is, the more frequent an epileptic syndrome is, the more frequent the seizures are, the worse they are, and the more poorly controlled they are, the likelihood of this starts to creep from almost negligible to really very high, that this is going to be somebody's cause of death. And there are many others, right? There are review articles on these lists of these Mendelianly transmitted epilepsies. That is to say, there's one gene, and usually it's recessive, and if you get both copies of it, you have the syndrome. But now we're going to talk about the more prevalent causes.